Cheers, mate. Good to have you.
Dobro jutro, Maribor.
Dude! Take a seat. Now, that was good. So I know you do a thing or two about with languages, right?
Yeah, a little bit.
A little bit. Now, you are obviously well known as you're one of the founders of Busuu. And you're Austrian. And you're now a member of the board of Austrian startups. How would you explain yourself? How would you introduce yourself? I'd be curious to hear that.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Bernhard, originally from Vienna, Austria, but I have to admit I've left Austria over 20 years ago. I didn't like this avoidance of risk-taking that the state secretary was talking about. So we really have to work on that, I think, here in Europe. I'm a bit more of a risk-taker. But I started my career in actually strategy consulting. Studied business before, then went into the world of PowerPoint and Excel. But I got a little bit bored by that because I always rather wanted to do my own stuff than telling other people what to do. And so I did an MBA at IE Business School in Madrid. It's an MBA very much focused on entrepreneurship. And at the random networking events, a bit like you guys are sitting there, I sat next to a guy I'd never spoken before. And he turned out then to be my co-founder. He told me about this idea that he would love to teach languages online. And I always loved learning languages. I speak 4 languages myself. And I believe, learning other languages just opens a door that is otherwise closed. It allows you to speak to the heart to people. And so I immediately jumped on. He was looking for a partner. I was looking for an idea, and then we kicked it off.
When you reflect back on that first conversation, because I think the first conversation between founders-to-be is like a first date. Like you've probably met a ton of people before. What is it you felt that he had, like on a founder level, that made you click?
He was just an incredibly nice guy. So my first recommendation is don't found businesses with asshole type of people. It will not work out. It's a little bit like a marriage, so you have to date a bit and then, make sure that you choose the right partner. And we also had complementary skills. So as you might have gathered, I'm a bit more of the extrovert. He was a bit more of the introvert. He had a tech background, and I came more from product, finance, strategy, etc. So we were a great team.
Now, that's maybe the second thing is so if you look at a team nowadays and there's 4 graphic designers and all of them are co-founders and co-CEOs, that's a red flag for you?
That's a recipe for disaster, especially if you're 4 people. So I now invest into companies and I normally not tend to invest into more than 3 founders because that's already a lot. You need to keep the equity share in mind, but also most importantly, it needs to be a diverse team. I mean, there's all the stats about how diverse teams beat basically the not diverse teams. Mm-hmm. So
I hosted a panel yesterday and it was a team and there were 6 founders and all of them had equal shares, which is kind of like a weird number.
Yeah.
And that was a bit of an awkward conversation. But anyhow, so you met your co-founder,
yeah.
And then you went on to co-found Busuu. And fast forward that, please.
Well, basically we founded in Madrid because we kind of liked the sun and the tapas there, so we just stayed there.
Sorry to interrupt you. That was the way you went.
That was the strategic thinking behind it. We just happened to be there. But also we launched in the midst of the financial crisis in 2008. You might remember Lehman Brothers collapsed a couple of months after we had founded the business. And so we learned the hard way that actually the best way to fund a business is by creating real revenues from happy customers.
Ooh. Ooh.
And it was 2 years of bootstrapping, no external financing, no salary, eating only very small tapas. And so we learned, but then also to generate revenues and had the first traction, and then raised our first angel round.
What age were you roughly?
31 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm curious, when you came into the whole startup thing and thinking, you'd done an MBA before. Did you feel trained for that type of company building?
Not at all. There's nothing that trains you for the roller coaster you're going into. And even after years and years of doing it, the roller coaster kept on giving.
And then you just said so bootstrap for 2 years, so basically paying everything out of your own pocket.
Yeah.
And then you got the first investment.
Exactly. Hansi Hansmann, Austrian guy. That man that some of you might know. I met him at a hike in Madrid. I convinced him to put his money not into hairdressing saloons, but rather into startups. which he then did afterwards. And then we raised a couple of other rounds from angel investors, and then we decided to move the business to London because we felt it's a better place to scale the business than being in Madrid, which was very much impacted by the economic crisis. So we moved everyone with roughly 200 moving boxes from Madrid to London and set up shop there.
I should have to ask one question. So for those of you that don't know, Hansi Hansmann is like the most prolific investor in Austria, I would say. He's basically single-handedly invested into most of the early well-known startups.
Yeah.
And you just randomly met him at a hike?
Yes. And I had this old BlackBerry that was pinging every time someone bought a premium membership. And he was just impressed by the fact that you can make money while being on a hike.
So you met your co-founder randomly, and you met Hansi randomly.
And actually, we went for a lunch and had a couple. Had one bottle of wine, and then he invested 300,000 euros into the business. And a couple of years later, I returned to him 50 million euros. So he was a happy investor.
Yeah, that's a good story to tell. So you made out of 300K, you made 50. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. Okay.
He did well. It was a good wine.
Yeah, and so you decided, okay, on the route to that's quite good wine, yes. And it was a lot of pinging on the BlackBerry then probably. So you took 200 shipping boxes and basically your whole team went to England. So traded tapas in good weather for bad food and bad weather.
And the tube, exactly. But look, I still believe London is a real strong ecosystem. But nevertheless, it's amazing to see also other places in Europe strive. And I think that's exactly what we need to do to lift up the ecosystem across Europe. And then I did, the big mistake that everyone does who raises too much money. At that time we raised 3.5 million euros. And we scaled from 10 to 50 people, was quite fast in hiring and onboarding people. And unfortunately, we also had the issue that we were launched as a website platform because we were launched prior to the iPhone. So the iPhone came out, the mobile phones came out, so we had to transition the entire platform from web to mobile, which my initial CTO that I fired far too late told me it's going to be 3 months. It then took us 2 years to do that. So we were stuck in the mud. A new competitor came out, a green owl that raised $180 million and gave the product away for free. So it was a difficult time. We had an investor that wanted to put money in. He pulled the plug a week before closing. So we were running out of cash. And so I had to let go of people. We had to make 10 people redundant. But because also I was quite ignorant to the whole topic of culture and building like a consistent and coherent team, an additional 30 people left the company within a couple of weeks. So we had a mass exodus.
They left willingly because the company was such a horrible place to work with.
There was some toxicity. They didn't like it. They felt I'm a shitty CEO anyway. So they left. With the positive side benefit that when all these people left, rather than running out of cash, we suddenly were cash flow break even because all these people had disappeared.
I mean, you talk about that in a very reflected way. It's called Confessions of a Founder. And basically, you just said in a very polite, that's the Austrian thing, you very politely said basically that you had created a very toxic environment, you were a shit CEO. Wow.
It was open feedback. But I think to a certain extent, maybe they were right because I was ignorant to this topic of how to build a culture-driven organization. And, when I was sitting in my big London office in the dark where everyone had left, and that was 7 years into building the company, I swore to myself, if I have the chance to do this ever again, I will do it with a culture-driven first approach. And that's what I did. I strongly defined the values of the organization, the so-called teach values: trust, efficacy, ambition, curiosity, and happiness. And then most importantly, we operationalized these values by so-called behaviors. Because one thing are values, these are the shiny posters you put next to the ping pong table that no one really cares about. But culture is really how people behave. Culture is what people do when no one is looking.
I love that definition. But I'm curious about one thing. So people leave, and probably your first human reaction is going to be, why are they leaving? Why are they leaving this ship? I'm right, don't go. How did you talk me through the process of coming to that conclusion that it's probably about culture, probably something not working, and then finding a solution? Because that's probably a very dark place.
Yeah, look, if everyone around you kind of leaves you, maybe you're also part of the problem, right?
Potentially.
And then at the time also there was a lot of talk about Airbnb and of how culture eats strategy for breakfast and all these things. So I started to research a little bit more about it. And we then hired also an external consultant to do this whole thing. And We then defined behaviors for each of the values. So for example, curiosity. One behavior was become the best version of yourself. Or trust, deliver on your promise. So if you say you're going to release a version of the app on Tuesday, you should deliver it on Tuesday, not on Wednesday. So we were quite explicit about our culture, and we operationalized that along the entire value chain of the employees, from how we wrote the job ads, to the interview questions, to the probation pass. So at times, a third of people not passing probation, because if not everyone in the team was thumbs up that they were actually a value fit, we would cut the ties. And we all know that it's much more expensive to let people go later down the road than actually quite early in the journey. So we are quite strict about this, and we created to a certain extent, I guess, some kind of cult, but that was very positive for us, and it helped us to scale up to 200 employees.
I love it. By the way, you can ask Slido questions anytime. So whenever I see them pinging up, I'm happy to take them. So it's not happening at the end, but it's happening during, just to have said that. Now, so you get culture to work. You're suddenly seeing this thing is picking up momentum, and it's getting better and better and better, and traction and happiness and culture. And talk me through, like in a 30-second process of the Busuu story. What happened then?
Yeah. So once we really cracked it on the culture, we managed to hire the right people. And let's face it, I also was quite exhausted after this near-death experience. So I also hired people. I call them the tent pole. People that also hold the tent. Well, you as a founder are sometimes a bit tired, and I think that was really, really needed. And I had a few of these tentpole people in the business, luckily. And we then scaled. We offered basically 15 languages with the ability to practice your skills with native speakers. So it was a community element. We offered it to consumers. We were growing at about 20,000 people a day. So we grew up to 100 million users over time. We also added a B2B business where we offered the language courses to large corporates like Edtech and others that can train their entire employees with language courses. We focused very much on the efficacy of languages, because initially we were the most gamified language learning app, but we were pushed out of that by these other competitors. We had to focus on a specific niche. And then we basically created over 40 million in revenues up to the exit in 2021, and then we sold the business to a listed company in the US.
The number you sold it for is, you said you turned 300K into 50 million. So what was the exit amount?
We sold it for 385 million euros.
That's a big number.
It is a big number, yeah.
That's crazy. I'm curious. How does that happen? Does it happen that someone says, "I'm going to pay that much money"? You say, "Yes, we're done," or is that a process? Had been people knocking on your door before?
So we were one of the lucky and few industries that actually got accelerated by COVID. You might remember when you guys were locked up at home, you were either baking bread or learning languages, and that's what happened. We could literally track the lockdowns across Europe by our download stats. So if Italy went through the roof, there's another lockdown here. So we got accelerated quite a lot, and I think we managed also quite well the entire process. We also acquired a tutoring business a month before COVID hit, and that business went through the roof. So there was a few lucky elements to that. And then I got approached by a strategic buyer who told me they looked at the business, they saw the growth.
Sorry, what's a strategic buyer?
A strategic buyer is basically someone, it's not a financial investor like a private equity, for example, but it's someone who is in, let's call it, in the education industry and has a strategic interest to acquire your business. And I know this strategic buyer, I cannot say who it is, from the past, and they said they screened the entire market and they know Busuu is the most effective way to learn a language, they love it. They're gonna do a quick and lean process to acquire the business. And I always say, whenever you hear quick and lean from a large organization, a lot of alarm bells should normally go on, because it was probably the opposite of quick and lean. We were at that time 150 people as employees, and they sent 120 people into the due diligence. So we had a near one-on-one coverage on consultants and all sorts of advisors on each employee.
120 doing due diligence?
Yeah.
Wow, that was fun, I guess.
It was incredibly fun. I received thousands of questions on all sorts of who bought that chair, who was sitting on this chair. I could answer whatever you could imagine. Even though we passed the DD with flying flags, they still couldn't make up their mind, as happens sometimes with large corporates. And then we slipped out of exclusivity, and it came the moment where we said, look, it seems like this is not going to go anywhere. So at that moment, you were allowed to pick up the phone. I could drum up a couple of other people that were potentially interested in the business. And that's where Chegg came in, the company who ultimately acquired Busuu. They were quick and lean because they had acquired businesses already before. So within a couple of weeks, and by then we had the best data room in the world because everything had been looked at. So we managed to then close the deal a couple of weeks later.
That chair, 112 euros, 108 for you now. 3 seconds.
Exactly.
There's a couple Slido questions. I just want to pick out one or two. You did mention your co-founder quite early on. Yeah. And there's one question. What was the role of your co-founder during the scaling process?
Well, funnily enough, he actually stepped back. So he had no role other than being on the board and a significant shareholder and supporter of the business. But he, after a couple of years, decided that it's not for him. And I think it's a very important lesson because we managed for him to transition out on very good terms. And that was the best decision for him, but also for the business. Because sometimes a co-founder is not made for the scaling process. And he recognized that, and everyone was happy.
I'd just like to follow up on that before I get to the next. Maybe, I want to pick out one question here as well. As a founder, can you truly learn from the mistakes of others instead of your own? And could you share one example? I like that question a lot. So do you have to experience everything yourself?
Yeah, it's a bit like, can you learn how to play tennis by looking at Rafa Nadal playing tennis? Maybe, I don't know. I don't even play tennis. I guess, I think it's great to hear some stories like, don't hire too fast, build a culture-driven business, get investors on board, they're like a great culture fit. Yes, there's a few things. It would be silly to make these mistakes. But then there are others that you have to live through and really to form you as a person.
I think that's nicely put. So yes, there's overarching topics and groundwork. But, yeah. What I'd love to know is how did you feel in the process of exiting? And then once the exit was signed, I would assume it's more and more stress, anxiety, nervousness, and suddenly there's that signature. Is it like relief or is it disbelief?
Because we had been approached. I mean, I was 13 years in the trenches, so this was a classic European overnight success. And we had been approached by many potential acquirers over the years. And for one reason or the other, luckily, it didn't work out. And with that process specifically, I just changed my chip. I was like, you know what? We have an amazing business. I love what I do. I love learning languages. I love this industry. I could do this for another 10 years. And if this process doesn't go through, you know what? We're just going to continue building. And that was the perfect attitude. Kind of, I guess that's what poker players do. Like, you know what? It doesn't really matter. Because I knew that I had an amazing business. And with that attitude, I was not desperate. Because the best businesses are being bought, not sold. And if you're like constantly trying to push and please acquire me, and it doesn't matter, like this other, because you have 300 pages of shareholder agreements, and there's so much legals and notary. We had a Spanish holding company selling to a US Inc. I mean, lovely. Yeah, it was absolute crazy. But I had this right attitude that even until the last day, if shit hits the fan and the money doesn't come through because of whatever, I don't mind.
When I was like 14, 15, when I would sit around with my friends and we'd talk, what would we do if we get stupidly rich one day? Probably all of us agreed quite quickly we would buy an island. And my idea was to have the Nordschleife on the island and buy Niki Lauda's old Formula One Ferrari.
Okay.
That was basically the plan.
Sounds crazy, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, why not? The funny thing is, I know a lot of people who had these plans when they were 15, and a lot of people who then eventually do have successful exits. And none of them ever do that stuff, but they all end up going like, yeah, but I'm doing the same thing. So I've had the feeling that you think an exit is a life-changing thing to happen.
Yeah.
But in most cases, it doesn't seem that way. Just people end up building more businesses, investing more. How would you define the impact of your exit on your life? And maybe also, what was your expectation of how an exit would be over the years, and how did it turn out and that?
Well, I would say if your own motivation or your only motivation to do a startup is to one day get rich, you will actually never get rich because you will not make it through that. You need to have this passion to really love what you do and strive through all these struggles. And that's why when one day the money hits, of course it's wonderful and it does change the life because, you know, at a certain extent it makes it creates a lot of optionality in life. Let's put it that way.
I like
but
that.
Equally, you know, I guess once you're driven, you're always a driven person. I mean, I allow myself right now a bit of time out and spending time with the kids and investing too much into other startups. But whenever I invest, I'm like, why don't you do this and that? So I'm also too much of an operator, and one day maybe I'm going to come back.
Asking for a friend, what is stuff you invest in? What are you looking for?
So mainly I invest into impact-driven businesses. So I like businesses that make the world a better place. Think about education or climate, but you know, there's different interpretations of that. And I'm looking for the 3 Ps in founders, which is my own definition. Positivity. The state secretary talked a lot about optimism. You really need that if you want to strive as a founder. Passion. You really need to care what you actually do. Don't go into insurances because you should think there's going to be money to be made. You need to really care about the problem. And perseverance.
Oh, I love that word. It's my favorite word. Okay, good. I like that. So passion, positivity and perseverance.
Right.
If you have that and you're one of the industries, you'll probably have heavy pitching there. I mentioned that you are, so obviously you're investing and you are also now a new board member of my former baby, Austrian Startups. And there is a very, very pressing question at the top, which I'm going to ask in about 20 seconds. But I'd like to know, because you said you have options, you said you're looking for these factors, and then you decided to put some of your time into Austrian Startups. Why did you take that step?
They tried quite hard to convince me, to be honest. It took them some time. I mean, let's put it, why not? Like if you had success as a founder and a bit of time on your hand, like why would you not, you know, give this time to also give back and pay forward? Because I, you know, was born in a time with my Busuu startup where there were hardly any startups. Yeah. I mean, in Madrid there was absolutely nothing. And I remember I visited Vienna and thinking about whether we move it from Madrid to Vienna. It was horrible. I mean, I was even being told off by the grumpy waiter in the coffee place that I'm not allowed to use my laptop. I was like, this is no place to build startups. And I went to London and I was quite impressed. And I guess many of you might have visited the city. There is such a vibrant vibe. And it's nothing compared to what we have in Silicon Valley. So I think we as Europeans, if we want to get our shit together, we really need to invest into the ecosystem and lift each other up. And that is being done by people who maybe have seen some journey of the mountain and you know, can tell how it actually had been and what to learn.
And that's the perfect point where I want to ask you the most pressing question on Slido, and that's, how do you think Europe's slow adaptation to fast-growing tech will impact brain drain? I heard the Slovenian secretary say that Slovenia aims to create a startup-friendly environment by 2030. Will most startups fail by then? That's a good question.
Well, I would encourage to the state secretary to create that startup-friendly environment by 2024, ideally, not by 2030, because we really need to speed up. We don't have time. But on the brain drain, I would say Europe has an incredible opportunity to actually get access to talent, especially from the US. Because let's face it, not everyone is a fan of the orange man. And we really have now an opportunity to get researchers, entrepreneurs, back into a continent that is a democratic continent that has great values, amazing quality of life. I mean, just been driving around a little bit in Slovenia, beautiful country. So I think we have something that maybe the US doesn't really have. And so we should be super aggressive. And I know the EU is trying to, but Slovenia can also do their own thing, you know? Mm-hmm. They can be quite aggressive and maybe do a visa for Americans or, you know, people from Asia to come here. There's also a way to, by the way, attract expats from Slovenia to come back with tax incentives.
Yes.
There's a classical incentives on early stage investments that the UK does. It's a playbook where you can get a cashback on your early stage investments. I mean, it's all there. We really don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Clear words. Thank you for that. Fun fact, that cashback, we had that in Austria for, I think, 7 months, and then it was turned off again a couple of years ago. I managed to invest in that time frame. It was a nightmare to get the cash back, but still, anyway. We had the first question on there. Now, there's the second question is, which topics interest you now? What does the world really need? You kind of mentioned that as well.
I think we covered
so maybe we can kind of get rid of those questions. Interesting. How to track European tech founders that they need a business people on the founding teams.
I'm not sure about that, but I would say someone at least in the team needs to understand the numbers. I think one maybe important learning from Busuu is we only raised 16 million euros and sold for the nearly 400. Because I was always laughed upon stage because I was the guy who never really raised a lot of money, and I always believed fundraising is not a sign of success. It's a sign of capital inefficiency, that you need a lot of cash to fuel your business. And if you constantly need to put gas in the tank, maybe there's a hole in the tank. So you need to really, I think, be very careful of where you spend your money. Of course, if you build an LLM, you might need a couple of billions, but let's face it. I think it's really important to be very, very strict on your capital expenditure and have a strong control on your unit economics. How much does it cost to acquire a customer? What's the lifetime value? And someone in the team needs to understand that.
Now, Bernhard, time is really flying, so I'd like to do 2 very quick questions, and then I'm going to try and summarize what we talked about. I think we could talk for 2 hours. We're having fun. First question is a quick one. Where does Hansi usually go hiking? Someone wants to know.
Well, less in Madrid, more in Austria, but I'm not sure you find him necessarily there to pitch.
Okay, and maybe one very quick, because you see the time is up. How did you manage the team morale impact from the appearance of Duolingo? And can you share more details? Maybe in 10 seconds.
No, obviously, I mean, it's hard to suddenly get a competitor with unlimited funding that gives away the product for free while you are trying to sell your product for 10 euros a month. I mean, it is tough. But we were lucky enough that the language learning industry was big enough. I mean, it's about a $40 billion spend, 1 billion people learning English alone. So we always felt not everyone is going to use that product. Some people want to actually learn a language rather than being on a 350-day streak without knowing anything about the language they're learning. So we focused on efficacy. And that was our niche. And that's, I think, a very important learning. Choose your niche and really own it. Really understand who are the users in the niche, how to get to them, and how to create maybe some sort of competitive moat around it so that no one else can steal them.
Clear words. Thank you. I want to try and summarize that now. So what we learned right now is from vision to multi-million exit. You can shake your head or say, yep, thumbs up, that was okay. We learned that at the end of the day, you have to be a nice guy and not an asshole. That's people you should be looking for. Don't work with assholes. We understood tapas and sun might be nice to start off, but ideally you go to an ecosystem where it's not about food and weather, but really a big and thriving ecosystem. Sometimes things happen by sheer chance, the way you met Hansi. And then we saw also that sometimes things seems to go well, but it doesn't mean much. And even if you hit rock bottom, that's just that day and that you can build up upon that.
Absolutely.
But you have to start with yourself, and that culture is not a nice thing to have, but it's a critical factor. And you said so nicely that culture is essentially how people behave when you don't look. You also said it doesn't make sense to carry all the ballast by yourself, but you might want to build tent poles, people who take that off you, and that it makes perfect sense at the same time to also, if you have someone who says, look, this is not kind of developing the way I want it to be, maybe there's co-founders who are great at starting off, maybe they have to take different directions, that's also fine. We understood sometimes there's external factors that can slow down, there's external factors that can speed up. In your case, COVID was probably quite an interesting circumstance, but it's what you make of that circumstance.
Yeah, don't build your business hoping for another pandemic.
That's ideally not going to happen. And you shared the 3 Ps with us, which are absolutely essential for you. That's passion, positivity, and perseverance. So if you have those, then you should be talking to that gentleman over there who also says, if you want change, don't wait. Change should have happened yesterday. Happy with that summary?
Absolutely amazing.
Bernhard, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Bernhard Niesner, for being with us. Thank you for asking those questions.
Yes.
Thank you, Bernhard. Cheers, mate. Thank you.